my dad and my uncles and, everyone in town served in the military during World War II. And there was only one member of my family that didn't come back, and that was Bud Kelder. The only thing that I knew about him was that when I was about 15, I accompanied my grandfather to visit his sister, my great aunt. And while I was there, I was looking at the pictures on her wall, and I asked about the little boy. And she just choked up and couldn't talk. And my grandfather said, that's Bud. So I didn't ask anymore. And when I got home, I asked my mother, who's Bud Kelder? And she told me the story about the Bataan Death March and how Bud had never come home. And it had always been a terrible family tragedy because they didn't know what had happened to him. He just disappeared during the Bataan Death March.
Welcome to Left Behind, a podcast about the people left behind when the U.S. surrendered the Philippines in the early days of World War II. I'm your host and researcher, Anastasia Harmon. My great-grandfather, Al-Massam, was one of the POWs, and his memoir inspired me to tell the stories of his fellow captives. It's now officially summer vacation in my house. My kids are out of school, and our travel trailer is loaded and ready for some adventures, which means I'll be switching to my summer schedule, publishing an episode every other week, although there may be a few additional off weeks. Today's episode tells the story of two young POWs who fell victim to the Cabanatuan POW camp's infamous zero wards. One of these young men had started his own fruit vending business in the years between high school graduation and his military service. The other spent those years traveling the United States as part of carnival sideshows as the man without a stomach. One came home shortly after the war, but it took more than 7 decades for the other to make his way back to his family. And today, we'll discover the years-long fight to bring him home. Let's jump in. Silas J. Whaley was born June 1st, 1914, in eastern Tennessee to parents Mac and Pearlie Whaley. Silas was the third of their 8 children. The Whaley family had deep roots in eastern Tennessee's Sevier County, tracing their presence back to the 1830s when Silas's great-grandparents settled there. Silas grew up in a rural area, working on the family farm and exploring the hollows, streams, and fields near his home. He attended the Friendship Missionary Baptist Church with his family, and in high school he played football, and then the 17-year-old even represented his high school in a stock judging contest, stock here meaning cattle. The area where Silas grew up lies in the heart of Appalachia, near the Smoky Mountains on the border with North Carolina. But according to a later newspaper article, in the early 1930s, the Whaley family moved to Sevierville, when the Great Smoky Mountains National Park acquired their farm. Not long after their move, Silas's father died in March 1932 of pneumonia and influenza, although that same newspaper article says that the cause was homesickness for the mountains. Almost 2 years later, Silas's mother died of tuberculosis. The nearly back-to-back deaths were hard on 19-year-old Silas, and he soon moved away from home. His sister, Lillard Molly Chance, later recalled, "He just couldn't stand it around here after our mama died." Starting when he was a child, Silas had a knack for entertainment. He amazed friends and family by contorting his stomach in ways that made it look as though he had no stomach at all. Silas used this unusual talent to find employment, performing around the country with traveling fairs and carnivals, and billing himself as the man without a stomach. Silas would later perform this trick for his fellow POWs at the Cabanatuan POW camp. My great-grandfather Al-Massam wrote about a soldier
who was on tour at one time, according to a statement with, believe it or not, Ripley, as the man without a stomach. He gave us a demonstration one night, distorting himself so the place where his stomach was normally located was just a huge indentation clear back to his backbone.
The way that Psalm writes about this soldier has always led me to believe that Silas's fellow POWs didn't necessarily believe he'd been on tour with Ripley's Believe It or Not. So when I started researching Silas's history, I was skeptical whether he was actually part of a sideshow act, even more skeptical that I'd find anything. Well, it's a good thing I don't mind being wrong, because I found a couple images of Silas doing this trick. One is an advertisement for his trick, and it states at the bottom, quote, "Believe it or not," close quote. Now, I'm not certain if this was for the actual Ripley's Believe It or Not. The ad and trick are definitely along the lines of most early 1900s sideshow tricks that show off freaks and their medical abnormalities. Well, after a while, it seems Silas was ready for something different, and in February 1941, 26-year-old Silas enlisted in the Coast Artillery Corps at Fort MacArthur in California. The 6-foot, 165-pound young man had a light complexion, brown hair, and brown eyes. 5 days after enlisting, he wrote to his sister,
"Surprised to hear that I'm in the Army? I didn't wait for the draft, but enlisted for 3 years. I'm leaving for the Philippine Islands. Maybe I'll get to see some action over there against Japan."
Then, in November 1941, Silas wrote 2 more letters to his sister, asking about home, comparing the 100-degree Philippine weather to West Virginia's, and describing the mounting tensions that war was imminent. He wrote,
"We are waiting for Japan to make a move, and when she does, all hell will break loose. We can whip the Japs in 6 months. Answer me soon and don't worry. I'll be okay. Keep writing to me often."
Private Silas Whaley was part of the 60th Coast Artillery, which was an anti-aircraft group. A newspaper source says he was assigned to the communications section of the 60th Coast Artillery's Battery G, where he worked on stringing telephone lines. If that's true, he would have been on Bataan until April 8th, when he would have withdrawn with the rest of Battery G to Corregidor Island just hours before the peninsula fell to the Japanese. However, the official March 1942 roster of the 60th Coast Artillery states that Whaley was part of the headquarters company, which would mean he was likely on Corregidor from fall 1941 through the island's fall in May 1942. Now, personally, I tend to lean toward Whaley being part of the headquarters company and always on Corregidor, especially because the newspaper article's title was, quote, "Whaley was part of the infamous Bataan Death March," close quote, which is just false. Historical records show that he was captured on Corregidor and was not part of that forced march. And I spent way too much time searching for which battery he really was part of, so I could share what exactly he would have been involved with during the war. I came up empty-handed, which is so frustrating. But regardless of which battery Whaley was part of, in February 1942, he again wrote to his sister. His tone, this time, at least the way I read it, seems like forced optimism rather than the real belief in success from those pre-war letters.
"I can't say what you would like to hear, but don't worry. Everything will be okay in a few months. We'll come through with colors flying. The news will tell you all I can."
Exactly 3 months later, on May 6, 1942, Private Silas Whaley became a prisoner of war and was sent to Cabanatuan POW Camp No. 3. Shortly before Silas's capture, actually just days after Bataan fell, and when specific information about American servicemen in the Philippines was unknown, one of Silas's sister told the local newspaper, "I think it'll be all right. He'll come back, but I think I would rather have him dead than captured by those Japs." Sadly, she would very soon get her wish. Whaley seems to have become somewhat well known at Camp No. 3 during the summer months of 1942, due to his unique stomach contortion skills. They were memorable enough that Al-Massam mentioned them in the memoir he wrote at least 5 years later. Whaley also befriended a soldier named Abi Abraham. Abi Abraham is a fairly prominent figure in the Philippines World War II narrative, because of the tremendous amount of work he did post-war trying to identify fallen servicemen throughout the islands. And he'll have his very own episode in the future. A.B. himself has a record in the Guinness Book of World Records for longest tree sit at more than 120 hours sitting in a tree. So I guess he and Whaley have something in common outside their war service and time at Cabanatuan. Private Whaley often reminisced to A.B. about friends back home, raccoon hunts, and the beautiful mountains in Sevier County, West Virginia. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases ran rampant at the Cabanatuan POW camps in summer 1942. Alma Som wrote,
Due to our unbalanced diet and lack of so many nutritional items of food, our body moisture barometer was out of kilter. The desire to empty our bladder came upon us so suddenly while asleep, accompanied by a feeling of painful strain. We could hardly hold our water long enough to reach the trenches, ranging from 1/2 to 1 block away, depending on the location of the respective barracks. Those afflicted with active diarrhea or dysentery would find it necessary to make as many as 10 to 15 trips at night to both the urinals and latrines, not to mention the many trips made during the daytime. Those who were so infected lost a great deal of weight in a short time until they hardly had sufficient strength to stand up and make these numerous nocturnal trips. It became the habit of these cases to take a piece of shelter half or a blanket and lie all night long on the ground near the latrines. Frequently, when morning arrived, one of our recent comrades in arms, so situated, would be found dead. There wasn't any hospitals in the real sense. Across the road were a few tiny bayhays trying to pitch it for a medical center, but there were no facilities, just bare buildings, and the patient slept on a board floor with just his blanket underneath and no covering on top of him. This was merely a segregation or restricted area for the worst cases in the hopes of reducing the rapid spread of this deadly infection under the conditions these men had to live. Our doctors would visit the men and with a little personal medicine which they dispensed to the worst cases hoped to keep them alive. Due to the lack of proper diet, the men gradually began to die. They did their level best. Emetine, sulfa drugs, and other medicines so badly needed as specifics in the treatment of this scourge were not procurable at this time, and the Japs did nothing to speak of and cared less. Whaley fell victim to the dreaded dysentery, and although one of our best doctors on internal diseases and parasites did everything possible, the lack of proper medicines plus the poor fare reduced his strength, and he passed away.
Private Silas Whaley died at 7:30 a.m. on August 18, 1942, of dysentery and abdominal abscess. And I've always wondered if his stomach contortion abilities made him especially vulnerable to intestinal diseases, although a lot of men were dying of those things at that time in the camp. Whaley was 28 years old and had been at Cabanatuan Camp No. 3 for about 10 weeks. Alma Som continued.
Whaley is buried in a single grave in Camp No. 3, Cabanatuan. Most of those laid to rest at Camp 3 were placed in single graves with their identification sealed in a bottle at the head of the body. However, the daily deaths at Camp No. 3 were not in such great number as those occurring at Camp No. 1.
Yes, Cabanatuan Camp No. 1 was much worse, because most of the Bataan Death March survivors were located there. Death rates ran astronomically high. The U.S. Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA, historians and researchers wrote, quote, "In June of 1942, prisoners from Camp O'Donnell began to stream into Camp No. 1, joining the men from Corregidor and increasing the number of prisoners to over 7,300 men. Because of the poor health of the men from O'Donnell, the death rate at Camp No. 1 soared. By the end of the year, 2,642 had perished, compared with 69 in Camp No. 3. Close quote. Among those 2,642 Camp 1 men was 26-year-old Private Arthur Kelder. Arthur Herman Kelder, known to his family as Bud, was born on June 18, 1916 in Chicago, to Herman and Julia Kelder. He was the second of their 2 children, both sons. Bud's family had strong ties to Holland, where all 4 of his grandparents were born. Bud's grandfather, Herman P. Kelder, immigrated to the United States in 1867 and was the founder of H.P. Kelder & Co., a commission merchant firm which operated as a brokerage, buying and selling futures on the stock market for clients. And the word stock here refers to the business kind. Bud graduated from Schurz High School in Chicago in June 1935. In his yearbook, he expressed a simple but profound ambition, quote, to live a long life, close quote. He was active in school activities, serving as vice president of the engineering club and participating in the chorus. By 1940, 24-year-old Bud still lived in Chicago with his parents and older brother Herbert, who was a dentist with his own private practice. The 5'11", 150-pound Bud owned a fruit dealing business. He had blue eyes, brown hair, and a light complexion. On April 4, 1941, Bud enlisted in the military in Chicago, joining the medical department associated with the Air Corps, and he immediately began training in Rockford, Illinois. A couple months later, he was transferred to Hamilton Field in California, and in September 1941, his parents received a letter from him that was postmarked from Manila. When war began, Private Kelder was stationed at Sternberg General Hospital in Manila. Captain Lloyd Goad, whose story I told in episode 53, and Army Nurse Lieutenant Rosemary Hogan from episode 40, which is about her failed escape from the Philippines, were both stationed at Sternberg as well. When the U.S. forces withdrew to Bataan, Kelder was assigned to Bataan Field Hospital No. 2. And if you're interested, episodes 25 and 38 talk about details of life at that field hospital. After Bataan's fall on April 9, 1942, Kelder was part of the Bataan Death March and then endured Camp O'Donnell from mid-April to early June, at which time he and the remaining Camp O'Donnell POWs were transferred to Cabanatuan Camp No. 1. I want to take a moment to go into some details on the Bataan survivors and their movements from Bataan to Camp O'Donnell. I've mentioned in earlier episodes that numbers are a bit fluid when talking about Bataan and the Death March. And that's because records of men who died in the last days of battle and on the march weren't always kept, so it's hard to know the exact numbers. But I did find some interesting numbers in the official Cabanatuan Camp No. 1 history, which was written during their incarceration. And I think these numbers are helpful to know. Camp O'Donnell, that's the camp where the Death March ended, had approximately 9,200 American POWs at its peak. By June 1, 1942, the men had been there about 6 weeks, and a reported 1,324 men had died at the camp. That's 14% of O'Donnell's American POWs dying in just 6 weeks. An additional 3,000 American POWs had been transferred from Camp O'Donnell to out-of-camp details in other parts of Luzon, which is the Philippines' largest island. 3,800 American Camp O'Donnell POWs, all of them Death March survivors, were transported to Cabanatuan Camp No. 1 in 2 separate groups on the nights of June 1st to 2nd and June 3rd to 4th. The remaining 1,000 of Camp O'Donnell's original 9,200 POWs were hospital patients too sick to move, and they remained at O'Donnell. When the Bataan O'Donnell POWs arrived at Camp No. 1, the POWs captured on Corregidor in early May 1942 were already there. They had been moved from the Manila area between May 26 and 31st. 6,000 Corregidor POWs, including Silas Whaley, were sent to Cabanatuan Camp No. 3. The remaining 3,500 Corregidor POWs were split between Cabanatuan Camps No. 1 and No. 2, although Camp 2 closed within a few days due to poor water availability, and those men were transferred to Camp Number 1. Thus, when the 3,800 Baton O'Donnell POWs arrived, Camp Number 1's population swelled to more than 7,300 men. In an earlier Left Behind episode, I said that some of the Baton O'Donnell men came to Camp Number 3. I had found several conflicting sources when I wrote that episode, but since then I've located a couple more official sources that suggest that no Baton O'Donnell POWs were at Camp Number 3. I just wanted to be 100% clear on that. It is possible, however, that 2 sick-to-March patients from the Baton field hospitals were transferred directly to Camp Number 3 before the Corregidor POWs arrived. The Baton O'Donnell men, who had endured the unbearable Baton Death March and the disease-rampant horrors of Camp O'Donnell, came into Camp Number 1 already sick, weak, and starving, with little stamina or health left to fight off diseases. And, of course, they brought with them those contagious diseases. According to the DPAA, quote, by the middle of June 1942, the camp was divided into 3 groups and a hospital area. Though, as one doctor imprisoned there noted, quote, the hospital served only to segregate the very ill from the less ill, close both quotes. A colonel imprisoned at Cabanatuan later wrote,
the Cabanatuan Hospital was first opened in June 1942 under the command of Colonel James Gillespie. At the hospital there were 30 wards, made to hold 40 soldiers each, often holding up to 100 patients. In each ward were upper and lower decks made of bamboo slats. Each patient was allotted a 2x6 foot space. The seriously ill were kept on the lower deck. Fenced off from the hospital was a quarantined area containing about 10 wards called the dysentery section. Within the dysentery section was a building missed when the wards were numbered. Later, it was called the Zero Ward, due to the fact that a prisoner had 0 chance of leaving it alive, serving as a place to put seriously ill or dying patients.
I believe this is a description of the Camp Number 1 hospital, although people aren't often clear about which Cabanatuan camp they're speaking of. However, due to the size of the hospital described by the colonel, this would fit better with the structure of Camp Number 1. Historian Hampton Sides, in his book Ghost Soldiers, the epic account of World War II's greatest rescue mission, wrote, quote, in the hospital for the critically ill, known as the Zero Ward, doctors labored with improvised equipment and conducted operations with nothing more than what was termed vocal anesthetic. It won't hurt much. They constantly experimented and guessed their way through procedures. They concocted dysentery palliatives from guava leaves, cornstarch, and charcoal made from charred coconut shells. They cleaned wounds with maggots. Close quote. Another Army physician and POW at Cabanatuan described,
I could have easily predicted the rise of the death rate in view of the deficient diet and the lack of medication. For the first week or 10 days at Cabanatuan, there were about 10 deaths per day. By the middle of June, the grisly procession of dead had grown alarmingly to average 20 deaths per day. 20 men who had endured the terrible ordeal of Bataan, who were 10,000 miles from home, and who then died in the most miserable circumstances. For me, as a doctor, the most distressing thought was that they could have been saved, almost without exception, by proper diet and medical care.
While the summer months of 1942 were characterized by ravaging diseases, the crisis began to ebb in the fall as dysentery and malaria were brought under control. At that point, however, odd illnesses began to emerge. Illnesses the doctors hadn't seen before. One doctor wrote,
the whole place was a pathological museum. Most doctors would never see such cases in their entire life.
And that is because the Cabanatuan doctors were seeing the effects of long-term vitamin and mineral depletion. Historian Hampton Sides wrote that they were seeing firsthand that, quote, starvation had worked its way down to the biochemical substratum, down to the level of enzymes and amino acids, down into the cells of the brain. The doctors entertained such questions. What organs are the first to play out when a certain mineral is withheld? At what point during the process of nutritional strangulation does the body and even the personality begin to disintegrate and fray. People lost their voices, people lost their hair, they lost eyes, they lost hearing, they lost the signal of their peripheral nerves. Their teeth fell out, their skin fell off, they developed strange ringing in their ears. Rank metallic taste soured the backs of their tongues. Their fingernails grew brittle and developed strange textured bands that, like growth rings on trees, reflected times of relative plenty or abject dearth. Scurvy, pellagra, rickets, these were the ordinary ailments, and they were all experienced early on." Close quote. Private Bud Kelder was among the fall 1942 wave of starvation illnesses. He was admitted to the Cabanatuan Camp No. 1 hospital in November 1942 with pellagra, which is a disease caused by lack of vitamin 3. Symptoms include rashes, diarrhea, dementia, hair loss, swelling, and more. The 26-year-old died on November 19, 1942, and was buried in the Cabanatuan Camp No. 1 cemetery, mass grave 717, with 13 other men who died that day. And this is where Bud Kelder's real story begins. But before we jump into that, let's take a quick trip back to the Cabanatuan Camp No. 3 cemetery, where Private Silas Whaley was buried. The cemetery at Camp No. 3 consisted of organized individual graves, with a few exceptions, including the 4 executed men whose story I shared in episode 57. Al-Masam stated,
Most of those laid to rest at Camp 3 were placed in single graves with their identification sealed in a bottle at the head of the body.
That identification included a small paper report of death that documented the man's name, death date and place, serial number, cause of death, and some notes. Private Silas Whaley was buried in the camp cemetery's grave number 50, which was marked with his name on a hand-drawn cemetery map. In June 1943, nearly a year after Private Silas Whaley's death, official word of his passing reached his family in West Virginia. A year later, his sister, Lillard Molly Chance, received a letter from President Roosevelt. Quote, "In grateful memory of Private Silas J. Whaley, who died in the service of his country in the Southwest Pacific area. He stands in the unbroken line of patriots who dare to die, that freedom might live." Close quote. After the war, when A.B. Abraham was searching for the remains of fallen POWs, he used the Camp No. 3 hand-drawn map to easily find Whaley's grave, which was marked by a bottle with Whaley's death report inside. The note in that report reads,
"Tell Mom goodbye for me."
Those were the young private's last known words. But, as you may recall, Whaley's mother had passed away in 1933, well before his own death at Cabanatuan. The report of death, which I've posted on my website, clearly reads Mom. But this may have been a mishearing or misspelling on the part of a doctor or record creator. A West Virginia newspaper article explained, quote, "Silas often called his sister Moll. Her first name was Lillard Molly, and the Whaley family believed the note was meant for her." Close quote. In 1946, the military sent Sister Moll some pictures and souvenirs, which were all that remained of Silas's personal effects. Private Silas J. Whaley was returned home and interred at the Pigeon Forge Baptist Cemetery in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, in April 1949. He rests near both his parents, in the land and near the mountains he loved so much. In 1971, A.B. Abraham sent Silas's sister Moll a copy of his war memoir, dedicating it, quote, "In memory of Private Silas Whaley, who bravely fought in defense of the Philippines. Sevierville can be proud of such a brave soldier." Close quote. While the Camp No. 3 cemetery had single well-marked and organized graves, the cemetery at Camp 1 was quite different, and this was due to the massive number of deaths at Camp 1. Remember, 2,642 from June to December 1942, versus just 69 at Camp No. 3. The first official burials at the Camp No. 1 cemetery were on June 3rd. That's mere days after the camp received its first POW residents. And you'll recall that by mid-June, the camp was seeing 20 or more deaths per day. The camp's American medical personnel kept records of most men's death details. If the serviceman had a dog tag, it was placed in his mouth when he was buried. Otherwise, the man's name and death information was written on a piece of paper, which was then placed in his mouth. The DPAA historians wrote, quote, "Because so many men were dying, burial parties worked every day. Each morning the men would gather at the morgue and organize into teams to begin the march to the cemetery. The camp adopted a mass internment system, burying all that died on one day in one common grave. The burial party would deliver the dead to the cemetery and then dig the mass grave for the next day. In June and July 1942, the two highest mortality months at the camp, the Japanese did not permit markers or a specific organization for the placement of graves. The digging of large, deep graves was impossible due to the high number of daily deaths, plus the weakened condition of the men on the burial details. Heavy rains, with no drainage facilities, also hampered digging. Many shallow graves were dug during the early period, some so shallow that it was not uncommon for the rain to reveal portions of the buried bodies." Close quote. Interestingly, in August 1942, Baton Medal of Honor recipient Captain Willibald Bianchi became officer in charge of grave digging. I told the story of the action for which he received the Medal of Honor in episode number 20. Accurate burial records were not always kept. The camp graves registration officer stated, quote, "Due to the lack of organization, which can be attributed to many causes such as sick and disheartened Americans, lack of materials to carry on record keeping, and a decided lack of spirit of cooperation on the part of our hosts, the records for the early days were incomplete and in some instances inaccurate." Close quote. Beginning in December 1945, which was several months after the war in the Philippines ended, a graves registration unit from the Army's Quartermaster General's Memorial Division disinterred Cabanatuan Camp No. 1 Cemetery. As they disinterred individuals, they marked each individual's teeth on dental charts. The remains were then moved to a cemetery in Manila. The graves registration personnel sent the dental charts to the Memorial Division in D.C., where Dental Corps officers compared the charts of disinterred POWs with service records for missing individuals. In this way, they were able to identify nearly 300 individuals from Camp No. 1 Cemetery. Bud Kelder was not one of those identified by dental records. He had been buried in the Camp No. 1 Cemetery, mass grave number 717, with 13 other men who died the same day. When that grave was disinterred, 4 of the 14 were identified with dental records. The rest, including Bud Kelder, were reburied in what would become the Manila American Cemetery. And all of their families were told that their loved ones' remains were non-recoverable. Bud Kelder's relative, John Eakin, told me,
The reason that they couldn't identify him was because they didn't have dental records. And they didn't have dental records because they didn't ask the family for dental records. They only used military dental records. But of course, Bud, being a young private, he'd been in less than a year, and he'd probably never had military dental work done. They didn't have dental records.
However, dental records did exist, but the Army didn't have them. Do you recall what Bud's older brother's occupation was? He was a dentist. Keep this dental discussion in mind, because we'll come back to it later. In the meantime, though, I need to introduce you to John Eakin, who runs a website called batonmissing.com. He becomes quite important in Bud's story from this point out. Here's John.
In about 2009, I was looking for a project, and it was almost Veterans Day, and I thought, well, let's see if we can find a project with a military connection, because in my family, my dad and my uncles and, everyone in town served in the military during World War II. And there was only one member of my family that didn't come back, and that was Bud Kelder. And I really didn't know much about Bud or about his life. And I thought he would be the logical subject for my research. The only thing that I knew about him was that when I was about 15, I accompanied my grandfather to visit his sister, my great aunt. And while I was there, I was looking at the pictures on her wall, and I asked about the little boy. And she just choked up and couldn't talk. And my grandfather said, that's Bud. So I didn't ask anymore. And when I got home, I asked my mother, who's Bud Kelder? And she told me the story about the Bataan Death March and how Bud had never come home. And it had always been a terrible family tragedy because they didn't know what had happened to him. He just disappeared during the Bataan Death March. That's all I knew. So I started researching him, and I got his individual deceased personnel file, IDPF, and it was so obvious what happened to him. He had died in a POW camp, and the military had totally botched identifying his remains, and so they just buried him as an unknown. They told the family that his remains were non-recoverable. That was their term, non-recoverable. And everyone thought, well, that meant that they didn't have any remains to return. It turned out that they did have remains to return. They just couldn't sort out exactly which were his remains, and so they buried them all as unknowns.
The Individual Deceased Personnel File, or IDPF, that John mentioned is a file created for every serviceman or woman killed during World War II. It documents the Quartermaster General's Memorial Division's work to identify individuals killed in action, potential remains for deceased individuals, letters from witnesses who observed the death or burial, notes from family members, and so much more. I use IDPFs whenever I research a deceased American soldier for Left Behind episodes. They're invaluable. When John Eakin read through Bud's IDPF, he realized there were 10 unidentified remains who could be Bud, but who were buried as unknowns in the Manila American Cemetery. So he tried to get access to files that described these unknown individuals' remains. Unknown remains were given an identification number and had a file describing the condition of the remains, including the dental charts that were created when the remains were disinterred. And this brings us to a point that John has made to me several times. The Army's definition of non-recoverable wasn't the same definition as the family's. When the Kelder family was told back in the 1940s that Bud was non-recoverable, the family was left to assume and imagine all sorts of things. Perhaps Bud died by the side of the road during the death march and his body just gone forever. And, of course, sometimes that is what non-recoverable means. For example, servicemen who died on transport ships to Japan were often buried at sea. Their bodies truly were and are non-recoverable. But other times, such as with Bud Kelder, there were potential remains, i.e. those 10 unknown remains from the same mass grave, that could have been Bud's. But the family didn't know that until John Eakin, in the late 2000s, started asking the Department of Defense for those remains records under the Freedom of Information Act. The DoD refused, and eventually the Kelder family sued the DoD in federal court. The result? Not only did the Kelders get the records for the 10 unidentified remains that could be Bud's, but also, eventually, records of all the unidentified World War II remains. That was back in 2012. Now, as a reminder, the main reason Bud and the men buried with him were unidentified in the late 1940s is because the Army didn't have dental work to compare the remains with. However, as John Eakin continued his research into Bud Kelder, he realized that Bud's dentist brother had dental records for Bud. Those records indicated that Bud had distinctive gold inlays in his teeth. And only one of the unidentified remains from Mass Grave 717 had gold dental work. That set of remains, labeled X816, seemed to obviously be Bud Kelder. Armed with this information, John Eakin tried to have those remains officially identified as Bud.
The family briefing meeting that I attended, I tried to give them the records, and they wouldn't take them. They looked at me like I was from Mars. You want to do what? You want to identify an unknown? This had never been done before. So in about 2012 or 13, I filed another federal lawsuit and asked the court to order them to produce the remains so that we could test them. And ultimately, after we got through all of the preliminary objections to the lawsuit, the court did order them to produce the remains, and they had 30 days to produce them. Within 2 weeks, they had disinterred the remains from the American Cemetery in Manila and moved them to Hawaii and tried to get the lawsuit dismissed. No way were they going to give us access to these remains. It took them about 6 months to identify the remains. Within about 6 months, early 2015, the remains of Bud Kelder and several of the other unknowns who were buried in the same communal grave were identified and returned to the families.
73 years after his death, Bud Kelder could finally come home. However, there was a hitch.
The problem was that they only returned a few token bones. They don't have sufficient DNA laboratory capacity, nor the laboratory capability to properly identify all the remains. So they just give the family a few token bones and tell them that's all they get. And sorry about that. The technology exists that they could do it, but they intentionally use the wrong kind of DNA. Without getting too technical about it, there's different kinds of DNA identification. They use mitochondrial or mtDNA. Mitochondrial DNA, just in general, is slow. It's time-consuming to do the testing. It's expensive to do the testing. And most importantly, mitochondrial DNA is not unique to an individual. In some ethnic groups, you might find as much as 7% of the population that share the same mitochondrial DNA.
I recently spoke with a DPAA researcher who told me they are now using several methods, including testing multiple types of DNA when trying to identify unknown remains. So sounds like they have changed or updated some methodology in the last decade or so. And during that time, the various types of DNA testing in general have become more advanced and more cost efficient. In fact, mtDNA, which is DNA found in the mitochondria of a cell, is the least effective means of DNA identification. For example, you got your mtDNA from your mother, who got it from her mother, who got it from her mother, and so on down that daughter-to-mother line, eons back in time. You also have identical mtDNA as all of your biological siblings. Men have mtDNA, but they don't pass it on to their children. And that's because the mitochondria in a sperm cell is located in the tail, which is not absorbed into the egg at fertilization. Thus, only mitochondria from the mother is passed to that child. And there's your unasked for human reproduction lesson for the day. You're welcome. Anyway, because mtDNA does not mutate/change over time, many seemingly unrelated people share the same mtDNA. Thus, mtDNA is most useful for identifying people as belonging to larger ethnic groups, rather than for pinpointing specific individuals or families. Autosomal DNA, however, is individual and unique to you. It's a mix of DNA you inherited from your biological mother and father. This is the kind of DNA that you'll hear in court cases when they say there's a 1 in 15 billion chance or so that the DNA could belong to another person besides the defendant. No one can say that about mtDNA results. But autosomal DNA is more delicate. It deteriorates faster than mtDNA, and other environmental factors can destroy it as well. So, when identifying older remains, sometimes autosomal DNA just isn't an option. And all this is to just give you a quick and definitely not inclusive overview of a couple types of DNA testing. In August of 2015, Bud Kelder's remains, consisting of his skull and 3 long bones, were flown back to the United States on a U.S. Air Force C-17 aircraft and interred next to the graves of his parents.
As a Vietnam veteran, I don't know how many times I heard other guys, and I certainly felt this way. If we died, that wasn't a big deal. We were young, stupid, and bulletproof. But don't bury me in this red dirt over here. We all wanted to go home, one way or another. To us, Vietnam was the worst place that we could be. And we didn't want to be there for all eternity. I think that most GIs feel that way. Everyone deserves, if nothing else, they deserve to have their own name on their headstone.
And that is exactly what happened, even if it took many decades, for both Bud Kelder and Silas Whaley. Both of these men returned home to be buried for eternity in the soil where they called home. Sadly, though, thousands of American servicemen and women, including too many still from the Cabanatuan POW camps, have not yet had that opportunity. And I hope and pray that someday they will all be able to have their own name on a headstone. During the early days of World War II, African American servicemen were limited to working in the quartermaster units, doing support work such as preparing meals and being in charge of supplies. Next time, we'll look into the lives and experiences of some of the African Americans serving in the Philippines during World War II. So, be sure to hit the follow button so that you know when that episode goes live. This is Left Behind. Thanks for listening. You can find pictures, maps, and sources about Silas Whaley's and Bud Kelder's stories on the Left Behind Facebook page and website, and on Instagram at Left Behind Podcast. The links are all in the show description. For more details and information on the search for Bud Kelder, see Left Behind episode 19, as well as batonmissing.com. The links are all in the show description. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find and learn about Left Behind. Left Behind is researched, written, and produced by me, Anastasia Harmon. Voiceovers by Paul Sutherland and Tyler Harmon. Special thanks to John Eakin for sharing his work to bring Bud Kelder home and for providing Silas Whaley's IDPF. And remember to subscribe to Left Behind, because you won't want to miss next time's look at the African American experience on Baton and beyond.